So continuing to go further into the formatting, now we're going to do the type setting in terms of the typeface that we're using and the type size. Now right now, I'm just on my regular selection tool. I'm just going to double click to activate my type tool. And highlighting the type that we have, it's defaulting, which is a typical default for the Adobe programs, to Minion Pro Regular. Depending on the computer you're on or any presets that you've done yourself to your computer, you may have a different typeface showing here, and that's okay. But Minion Pro is Adobe and Apple's kind of unified default, we'll say. This is at 12 point, and 14/4 is the leading, or 14.4 is the leading. And the way we term that is if I was asked what the type size is, I would say 12/14.4, and being 12 point type over 14 for leading. And 14.4 is the auto. That's why we can see here, you can see it's auto and goes to 14.4, and that's what these parentheses indicate, that it's kind of the default for that. We'll probably leave ours at that and likely at 12 point. But I'm going to just click in here again and do a Command A to select all. And I'm going to choose Baskerville, which is one of the typefaces that I gave you. And again, if the typefaces I gave you aren't working on your specific computer, maybe you're on a Mac or something, you can download similar typefaces. You can even work with Minion Pro. It's a great typeface for body content. So Baskerville 12/14/4. And I did that in the paragraph settings, but you can of course find it as well in the character settings, and you can find it also if you go to your type window and open character. So having done that, we can now actually do our justification. It's quite simple to set the initial justification, and that again is probably showing in your character settings. And I say probably because due to laptop size and so on, you may have these hidden. They may be hidden by default. So you can always go again to the paragraph settings and you'll find them right at the end here. And the one we want to choose is justify with last line aligned left. And it's the align left that is typical by default. That comes in and it's aligned left and rag right. When we do justification, it's rare unless it's something like a more elegant invite, we'll say, something where a paragraph stands alone, where we would do justify last line aligned center. It's quite rare that I use that. And then center justified is where both the left and the right are ragged. So we're going to use justify with last line left. And this is where we get some odd spacing. So we talked about this in our typography lecture, where we would see some of the spacing being off, and we may have a fair number of hyphens and so on. So I'm going to select all again, and I'm going to start by trying to eliminate my hyphens. Whenever we can eliminate hyphens, that's great. Otherwise, we try to minimize them to 2 per paragraph. And even that can be a lot if you have a very short paragraph. But in the paragraph settings here, we can turn off hyphenate. Right at the top here, we can click that and just turn that off. For the most part, the spacing isn't too bad. There is a little bit of extreme spacing. If I click out of here and press my W to get presentation mode, and the reason I clicked out is so that I wouldn't put a W in my copy, we can get a clearer picture of where that odd spacing is. And there's a fair bit of it, and that's why we're going to adjust our justification settings. So I'll go back to working mode. And the justification settings are what we do when we do justification. When we're doing the left and right fully justified, clean edges on both left and right, we definitely have to do justification settings. In a piece like this, it's noticeable, of course, when we have the odd spacing, the increased spacing in some sections, and in others it may be quite tight, but it's an absolute when we're working in multi-page like a magazine or a book. So I'm going to again select all because I want to apply these settings to the entire piece of content. I may have to remove them from a couple of areas later on, but it's easier to do it all in one now. And we're going to go to Window and down to Type in Tables and open the Paragraph window. And in here, we also have the option, of course, to turn on and off hyphenate and select our paragraph justification, do our space before and space after, and so on. Many of the things that, of course, show up along the top. And what I like also about the top is that, again, it reflects whatever we're working on, and therefore we can minimize how many windows we have open on our screen, which may be helpful, especially if you're working with a laptop. Okay, so we're going to go into what's called the flyout menu here. And this little menu in the upper left or upper right corner is called the flyout menu. Some might call it the hamburger menu. I call it the flyout menu because this window flies out. And we're going to go right to justification. Now when we select that, we get this intimidating window of fields and numbers. And that's nothing to be concerned of once we understand what they are. So I'll walk you through what we're looking at first. Word spacing is the space between words that we'll be adjusting. And we actually leave this at default because of the rest that we're going to be fixing up. The default that we leave word spacing at will kind of, it will adjust as necessary to the rest. Because this is already at a minimum and a maximum that we would like. So of course, when we look at this, the columns desired is what we would want. 100% word spacing, meaning the proper spacing for that typeface and for this type size, and it's the default that we'd like. But we'll allow it to go to 133% wider or more open. And we'll also allow it to close about 20% down to 80 in order to bring those words closer together if necessary. Letter spacing is the same, only it's the space between letters. This is something that we have to be more subtle with because the spacing between letters is already very minimal, and we don't want the letters touching, and we don't want to affect the overall readability and look by bringing letters or allowing these letters to go too close to or even overlapping one another. And we're going to set that at -3. We'll leave the desired at 0, and we'll set the maximum at +3. Now you can see mine already changing in response to what I'm entering, and that's because I have the preview clicked on. So remember, whenever you see the option for preview, do that and you'll see things start to react and show what's going to happen when we click OK. Now glyph scaling is referring to the actual inked characters. A glyph is any character here that we see. Periods are a glyph, the number 2 is a glyph, any letter is a glyph, and so on. So this, again, we have to be very careful because we're making adjustments that really the eye can't pick up on, but we want to maintain that subtlety. If we went very extreme, we'd see the typeface lose its integrity because it would be too condensed or too stretched. So we're going to be quite subtle here and only allow about a 6% flexibility. So we'll do 97% on the minimum, and we'll do 103 on the maximum. And you can see again how things react. And they react, you'll see that I clicked into another field just to let that field take in the preview. So now this looks much better. It's also looking good considering that we've turned hyphenation off. So were we to allow hyphenation, this may look even better. It may be able to clear up some spacing issues that are happening after periods and so on, where they get away with a little more spacing. But overall, I like this amount of content without hyphens, and I think our spacing looks quite good. And these are the settings that we just did. They're the kind of the go-to when we initiate justification settings. They're not the absolute. Sometimes you get into a situation where you just have to play around with these a little bit. But quite honestly, it's very rare that these have not worked for me. And I've been using these settings for many years, and it's only been maybe a handful of times that I've had to go in and maybe change glyph scaling up to 107 or something. So if you can maybe take a screenshot or write these down and just leave it for reference, you'll be using this a lot, especially in magazine and book type setting. So we'll say OK and give that another look. So I'm going to click out so I don't put a W in my type, and I'll press W to get my presentation mode. And that's much better. And even if we squint a bit, squint your eyes, you won't see too many rivers. See a little bit over here, but for the most part, that eliminates a lot of the rivers in the type. So press W again. And I know I mentioned our type lecture, but we may not have had it yet when you're working on this tutorial. I believe it may come the following week. However, a lot of this will make sense as we get into speaking more about type, which is an ongoing conversation in our class, of course. So I'm just going to extend this box down to the margin. And one thing I want to do is get this credit to span the columns. And we can see in this content that it's spanning across both columns along the bottom. It's got a little more space ahead of it. And I want to also take note of which paragraph is starting at the top. Now this seems to be an ideal situation, which at the moment I'm looking at this and thinking, how did I do that? Because it actually turned out quite well, and it may even be the aspect that there's hyphens. So I may find I have to turn the hyphens on later anyway, but we'll see what happens when we get there. Again, we don't have to do a perfectly exact copy of this, but it would be nice because this one worked out quite well. So we have so far up at the top right, and we'll see how that lands when we do the span. So I'm going to highlight this content here, the credit and the credit content, and then on my machine, you'll see on my screen, you'll see that I have the span showing in the paragraph settings. This, for the most part on laptops, won't be showing. I don't believe it shows in the character settings because it is quite advanced in terms of paragraphs. So in the paragraph settings on my desktop, I can see the span columns icon right there. Now, if you don't see it, you can go down to, in that same ribbon, you can go down to the flyout menu of the ribbon at the far end here. And by the way, you also have a settings here where you can actually customize what is in your ribbon along the top. But if you go to this little flyout menu, you'll be able to go to span columns there. And it will be a little more informative, but it's doing the same thing. And what we want to select here is span columns and all. because we only have 2, so we're going to span all of the columns. And then here you can see space before the span or space after the span. This is where the space that we saw above the span was increased a bit. We can use space before, but we're going to try to avoid that right now because we'd prefer to do space after the paragraph that precedes that content. So for now, we'll just say span columns and all. And you'll see up on my screen as well, it will change. So we'll say OK. And this changed up here in mine too. So in fact, we may find that we don't need to put any space. We just have to see how things land once we get all the content in. But making sure that we have 2 columns fully justified, our space after being used to create the space between paragraphs, and fortunately for now, our so far has landed, this paragraph that starts with so far, it's landed at the top of the right side column, so that's good. If it didn't, we would insert a column break, and we may have to. And if we don't have to, we won't worry about that in this tutorial, but we will get to inserting break characters and spatial characters and so on.